So let's talk a little bit about starch first, and then we'll talk about glycogen and cellulose. So we eat starch, but we're going to store excess as glycogen. They're both really just a chain of glucose. Okay, so both starch and glycogen are both long glucose chains. So you're going to eat starch, and it's a chain of glucose. You've probably heard the terms simple carbs and complex carbs. Simple carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates. What does that mean? Well, what it means is there are two types of starch you can eat. One is called amylose, and one is called amylopectin. And just looking at these two molecules, which one appears to be more complex in structure? And which one appears to be more simple in structure? So amylose is just this twisted chain of glucose. So glucose being represented by this six-cornered ring, a hexose sugar. This is just a long chain. This one has branches. This is a major branch that comes off from it. So amylopectin appears to be more complex in structure compared to amylose. And that's firstly how they get their name. So amylose is what we call simple starch, and amylopectin is what we call complex starch. Why does this matter? What makes one, quote, better than the other? Well, here's what happens in the digestive process. So you eat some starch, and you start chewing it up. And let's pretend first that we're eating some amylose. So you would eat some French bread, any type of white rice, just plain old pasta, any of these forms of starch, a potato, and you start chewing it. And the digestion of that starch, breaking it down to glucose, actually starts in your mouth with an enzyme called amylase. Remember, enzymes end in ASE, and they tell you what they do. Amylase hydrolyzes the bonds of amylose. Remember, hydrolyze is the verb we use for hydrolysis. Adding water to break the bonds of a polymer back down into monomers. Hydrolysis. So amylase is going to start hydrolyzing those bonds between the glucose molecules, breaking these bonds, adding water and breaking those bonds back down into monomers. That is going to start in your mouth. So you're going to get this huge rush of sugar going into your blood, this huge rush of glucose going into your blood as soon as you start eating it. And once you've eaten that whole plate of pasta, all that glucose is now in your blood, in your bloodstream, all at once. Big rush. Whoosh. Okay, let's look at amylopectin instead. It's a complex starch. We do not have enzymes in our mouth to break this down. This is broken down by enzymes in the small intestine. So hydrolyzed by enzymes in the small intestine. This is where the bulk of our chemical digestion takes place. Most of these enzymes come from the pancreas. The pancreas is going to release some important carbohydrates enzymes to come in and break down this amylopectin. Does that happen the second you start eating your food? No, it does not happen in the mouth. And if you think again about your digestive process, if you know anything about human digestion, so we eat, goes down the esophagus to the stomach. The stomach is going to have a couple of very important roles in digestion, but one of the important roles it has is that food is pulsed out to the small intestine in tiny little amounts. Because what happens is that food is very acidic coming out of the stomach, and those enzymes in the small intestine can't function at that pH. Remember, we've talked about buffers and how buffers are necessary in order to have enzymes function properly. And enzymes function in a very narrow range of pH. So the stomach is going to slowly pulse this into the small intestine. So if we eat a complex starch, it's going to be digested, and that sugar is going to be released in small pulses, small little gradual amounts at a time. So instead of having this rush of glucose into the blood, this is going to be a slow, gradual release of glucose into the blood. Why do we need glucose in our bloodstream? What reaction are we trying to fuel with that glucose? Right, we're trying to fuel cellular respiration so we can make ATP to drive chemical reactions in the cell. So, isn't it better to have a constant gradual supply just from the standpoint of making energy? You would think that that would be a better plan. Well, not only that, but this rush of glucose into the bloodstream is going to be bad over time. Why? What is the key that gets this glucose into our cells? What do we need to get glucose into our cells? And if you don't know the answer to that, think about what a diabetic takes to get glucose into their bloodstream. Into their cells. What does a diabetic need to get glucose into their cell? What's the key that gets it in? It's called insulin. Insulin is a hormone. It's a protein hormone produced in the pancreas that plays a very important role in regulating our blood sugar. And there's an opposing hormone produced by the pancreas that's going to play an important role in blood sugar regulation as well. So let's look real quickly at these two opposing hormones, meaning they have opposite effect, produced by cells in the pancreas. The pancreas, by the way, is such an important organ, has so many important roles in your biological system. We've already said that it's going to release the enzymes that are going to digest the starch in the small intestine. And now it produces two opposing hormones that are then going to control the levels of that glucose in your cells and in your bloodstream. So two opposing hormones produced in the pancreas. And those are called insulin and glucagon. Insulin has two very important roles in regulating blood sugar. It gets glucose into the cell, and it causes excess glucose to be stored as glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates for animals, primarily in the liver, a little bit in the skeletal muscle. So insulin is going to cause both of those very important things to happen. It gets glucose into the cell, and anything that's left after a certain amount of time is going to be stored in the liver. Why do we not want glucose just cruising around in our bloodstream? Well, glucose is a pretty big molecule. If you think about what else is in your blood, water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, other very small molecules. Large molecules cause damage if they stay in the bloodstream for a long period of time. That's why diabetics go blind and lose fingers and toes and have kidney damage. That's where the tiny, tiny little capillaries are. And those can be very damaged by something as big as glucose staying in the bloodstream for a long period of time. So you eat this giant plate of pasta, and you get this rush of blood sugar, and a certain amount of that glucose is going to get into your cells, and it's going to go through cell respiration, and we're going to make ATP from it. Anything that's excess after a certain period of time is going to be stored as glycogen in the liver. Then, as your blood sugar starts going down, and over time, you need some of that glycogen released. That's the role of glucagon. Glucagon causes glycogen to be released as glucose. In other words, it's going to cause that glycogen to be broken back down into glucose and return to the bloodstream. So let's look at that. Homeostasis. You can think of a thermostat. Normal blood sugar level is around 90 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. So you eat, your blood glucose goes up, the pancreas releases insulin, some of that excess glucose is going to go into the liver as glycogen and be stored for later use, and it's going to cause the cells to take up the glucose. You store about a 4 to 6 hour supply of carbohydrate in your liver as glycogen, and then we're going to slowly release that over time. You're going to start feeling hungry again when your blood sugar gets below a certain level. By the way carbohydrates can make you fat is long-term storage of carbohydrates is fat. It's much more energy dense to store long-term as fat. So if over a certain period of time you haven't used up all the glucose that's stored in your liver as glycogen, it's going to go into long-term storage as fat. So that's how you can get fat eating carbohydrates. So eventually, that blood sugar level is going to go back down. If it drops below the set point, that's when the pancreas releases glucagon, causes glucose to be released again from the liver, and we're going to come back up to normal. So 2 ways to bring it up to normal. One is to eat glucose. The other is to have glucose released from that glycogen in the liver. So going back to the story of simple carbs versus complex carbs. If you're constantly slamming your cells with insulin because you're eating all this simple sugar, all these simple carbs, amylose. If you're mostly eating amylose, you're getting this rush of glucose and you're getting this rush of insulin. And over time, your cells become desensitized. It now requires more insulin than normal to get your cells to take in that glucose. Okay, and that is called type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is usually the result of poor diet and lack of exercise. A diet that slams your cells with insulin to the point where they become desensitized. It's kind of like living by the airport, hearing planes all day, and over time you don't hear them anymore. But maybe once a day a 747 comes in, and that one you hear. So it takes a bigger than normal amount of insulin to get your cells to recognize it. Type 1 diabetes you are born with. This is usually childhood onset, and in this case it's an autoimmune disorder in which your immune system actually attacks cells of the pancreas that produce insulin. So this is different. You can't control this. This is hereditary. Type 2 diabetes does have some hereditary factors. Some people are more predisposed to get diabetes if they don't have a healthy diet and a healthy lifestyle. So that's why it's important to understand the difference between simple and complex carbohydrates. So much better to eat complex carbohydrates, brown rice, whole wheat pasta, things that have amylopectin as their source of carbohydrates rather than this simple starch. Okay, one more type of carbohydrate you need to know about, and that is cellulose. And cellulose, again, is a structural polysaccharide, and it forms the cell walls of plants. So cellulose is structural, and it forms the cell walls of plants. We cannot digest cellulose. No animals can digest cellulose. Only prokaryotes have the ability to digest cellulose. And we're talking primarily bacteria. So what happens then? If we eat a lot of cellulose in our diet, a lot of plant material, and we can't digest it, what does that become in our diet? It becomes fiber. The screen is not working. It becomes fiber in our diet. Some animals eat a diet very high in cellulose. Think about grass. You and I don't eat grass, okay? There's a reason for that. It's too high in cellulose. First of all, it's really hard for us to chew and break down mechanically. And second of all, it's probably going to make our stomachs hurt a lot. If your dog eats grass, you see what happens to him. He thinks it's good for him, but it's not. Some plants have a very thick cell wall and a lot of cellulose. Okay, so a plant cell, nucleus with the DNA, plasma membrane, we'll talk about all this in more detail. And then on the outside is a cell wall composed of cellulose. A structural polysaccharide. It is very linear compared to starch. It's not twisted. It's very linear. And these tend to clump together and form that thick fibrous tissue on the outside of plants. Okay, so this is starch. This is glycogen. By the way, glycogen is very branched. And then this is cellulose. And it really comes together to form almost like a rope. This very fibrous structure. I said before, we cannot digest cellulose. We do not have the enzymes. Animals do not have enzymes to digest cellulose. Only bacteria do. So those animals who have a very high cellulose diet, cows and deer, really anything with hooves, has a diet very high in cellulose, they have bacteria in their gut, symbiotic bacteria in their gut, who do have the enzymes to break down that cellulose. And they're the ones digesting the cellulose for their host. It's this mutualistic relationship where the bacteria are digesting the cellulose for the animal, and then they're getting nutrients in this warm, safe place to live. So animals who eat a diet very high in cellulose actually have bacteria in their guts who do the digestion for them. We do not. Remember, I said several times already that shape is key in biology. And that glycosidic linkage, that covalent bond that links the glucose together, is different in starch than it is in cellulose. That's just a closer look at cellulose. Okay, so this is starch. This is the glycosidic linkage in starch. You can see the bond, the oxygen pointing down. This is cellulose. Just that slight difference, alternating versus same pattern. Without going into detail, this is called an alpha glycosidic linkage, and this is called a beta glycosidic linkage. We can digest, break down, hydrolyze alpha glycosidic linkages. We do not have enzymes to hydrolyze beta glycosidic linkages. Only bacteria do. No animals can digest cellulose. Okay, so it's just a different structure, and shape is key. The enzyme that we have will not break down the cellulose. Okay, so those are carbohydrates. Very, very important in our diet. Very important as an energy source. Very important to understand, including this structural polysaccharide. We're going to look more at the cell wall when we talk about cells.